afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim Roeder, and I work with Amherst College, and I'm very pleased to be assisting with the program today. Nancy Pick is our guest speaker, along with her research assistants. And Nancy is from the class of '83, and she has just released a book that is part of the Bicentennial book series, I Heart Mind. And today she's going to talk a little bit more about what it meant to write this book and the behind the scenes story of it. So I'm going to turn you over to Nancy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Just wanted to let you know that we are being recorded. So we're going to take a journey into Amherst history and the process of writing this book. And as it happens, two of my three amazing research assistants for the project are celebrating their 5th reunion as members of the class of 2016. Yay! Reuniting by Zoom isn't exactly ideal, as we all know. And I think that they're hoping to have some kind of in-person event during the next year. But here we are, and let's make the most of it. So I got the assignment from the college to write a bicentennial book back in 2015. And at first I figured, piece of cake. This is going to be a relatively easy, straightforward book to write. And then suddenly the assignment grew into something pretty terrifying. Anyone who's ever come through this place is smart and unusually opinionated. I knew the college politics would be difficult to navigate, especially for someone as old as I am. And how on earth was I going to make good choices? So I started to fret. Along those lines, I want to mention the book that I'm currently reading, which is called Unwinding Anxiety by Dr. Judson Brewer, who teaches psychiatry at Brown. His premise is that we can't stop bad habits like smoking or stress eating, or in my case, obsessive worrying, simply by acts of willpower. One of the most important tools turns out to be, drumroll please, curiosity. For your brain, it turns out that curiosity is better than chocolate. Brewer writes, with anything unpleasant, especially anxiety and panic, we tend to run away from it, which then becomes a learned behavior. But when you're curious about something, it effortlessly pulls you in because it in itself feels good and rewarding. During the 5 years I was researching and writing the Amherst book, I was at times worrying about my deadline and various other pressures. But along the way, I figured out all on my own how to self-medicate with nothing other than curiosity. No wonder I ended up enjoying the process of creating the book so much. Heading into this project, I fully expected to find a useful prototype that some other college on a hill had already written. But that turned out not to be the case. The other school histories read like dull tracts written by a second-rate PR firm, or else they looked like high school yearbooks. So I realized I was really on my own, and I set some priorities. One was humor. Humor is really important to me, and I did think about including some prankster humor in the book until I discovered that it translated really badly to the page. This is Mickey Mouse with Bruce Becker from the class of 1980, who was a great prankster, but the photo didn't end up in the book. This is a stereoscope view of the octagon. And more than one of these did end up in the book, but my initial idea about how to use them didn't make the cut. So I wanted to use the complete double view that you can see here, and then tell people to get a hold of a pair of Google Cardboard glasses so that they could view the stereoscopic images in 3D using their phones. Kind of like that. That was our attempt at home, but that idea just didn't fly. This wonderful bit of Amherst memorabilia came from the collection of Brian Meacham from the class of 1997, who is not only a film archivist at Yale, but who also has an astounding private archive of Amherst memorabilia in his basement. We called his collection Amherstiana, and we ended up using many images from his trove in the book. Also, I want to thank Stephen Pedagorski from the class of 1975 for taking so many beautiful photos, as like this one, as the official book photographer, that it was truly difficult to decide which ones to publish. And this was from Brian's time at Amherst, something that he himself had saved. And so he was especially pleased that it actually did end up in Eye, Mind, Heart. At the opening of our facility, we had 4,224 bowls. We now have 508. Please return. Amherst history. And this is Dr. Cuthbert Simpkins from the class of 1967. He gave a slyly amusing account of the origins of the Black Student Union in an interview that Matthew Randolph will discuss in more detail in a moment. If Matt doesn't tell the full story here, well, you'll just have to buy the book. Also really important to me, besides humor, was to do some original research. I realized that I was incredibly curious about what student life was actually like at different times in Amherst history. And I ended up focusing on reconstructing that in some detail for intervals of every 50 years. And in terms of my own research, one priority for me was getting into the Library of Congress to find out what was in the files of Charles Hamilton Houston, class of 1915, a prominent civil rights lawyer known as the man who killed Jim Crow. It seemed that the finding aid indicated that there were documents from his Amherst days at the Library of Congress, but I couldn't get to Washington. And so I applied a little Amherst ingenuity. I hired a woman from the Folger Shakespeare Library, owned by Amherst, to walk over to the Library of Congress and search for me. And what a thrill to discover that Charles Hamilton Houston was a cartoonist. Also, his responses from this student survey in 1915, this seems worthy to me of a student history paper, if not a senior thesis. They're really fascinating. Plus, I really do hope that the Bicentennial book will be a launching pad for many Amherst students who are looking for research projects in the future. Whoops, oh no, sorry. Jumping ahead here. Okay, this is what I want to be. I learned about Herman Muller's time at Amherst from Jeffrey Hall, class of 1967, who won a Nobel Prize in 2017 for physiology or medicine, and who kindly granted me a phone interview. I almost couldn't believe the story that he told when he first told it to me. Muller came to Amherst in 1940, taking an untenured position in biology. He was a socialist, and his radical politics made it difficult for him to find a job at the time. Amherst let him go 5 years later in 1945, and then Indiana University took a risk and hired him. Just 1 year later, in 1946, Muller won the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine for his discovery that mutations can be induced by X-rays. For Amherst, that was truly the one that got away. And we'll hear more about interviewing Nobel laureates from Michael Harmon in a moment. I wanted the book to be beautiful. That was another priority besides the humor and the original research. And I spent a ton of time tracking down images. The artist Fairfield Porter spent a year teaching and painting at Amherst from 1969 to 1970. But unfortunately, the Mead Art Museum doesn't own any of these Amherst scenes, and they turned out to be tricky to track down. This one is titled The Campus, a title that didn't exactly help my sleuthing efforts. But eventually, I did find the painting in the Paris Art Museum in upstate New York. It's the only view I know of that actually makes Ross Library look beautiful. The photos for the book cover was really important for me. They were taken by a photographer named Susan McCullough. Susan, who is, by the way, the wife of Rachel Maddow, specializes in taking Polaroids, which I love. And she uses old film so that the results are always evocative, maybe even a little bit dreamy and unpredictable. Also, she was willing to get up in the college's cherry picker to take photos of Johnson Chapel. These are some of the versions that she sent. They have, as you can see, very different atmospheres. This was spooky Amherst. This one is heavenly Amherst. And that's the one that we ended up choosing as the book cover. And another really important category for me was firsts. Given the sophistication of the college archives under the direction of the encyclopedic and erudite Mike Kelly, I was expecting to just show up and say, I'd like a list of firsts, please. And then they would just give me the list. But it actually turned out that nobody had done the research. And firsts are just really important because there's such obvious markers of change and such clear places to begin a research project. The college didn't know the names of its first, but beyond the obvious ones, like Edward Jones being the first Black graduate in 1826. In fact, it turns out that the college had never professionally archived its own history along the way. And so its collection related to its own history is kind of random and spotty. Of course, one of the first that is well known is that of Joseph Hardinissima from the class of 1870, the first graduate from Japan who went on to found Doshisha. But the story of Ting Liang Ho from the class of 1883, I'm using anglicized names that these men used at Amherst here, was hardly known at all, even though it's really fascinating. He came over as part of the Chinese educational mission, an ill-fated attempt to educate 120 Chinese students in the US between 1872 and 1881. Ho was the only student from this group who came to Amherst. Many went to Yale. His story is actually quite heartbreaking, and you'll have to buy the book to find out more. Who was the first woman on the faculty? It turned out to be this woman, Madeleine Boucher-Utter, who filled in as professor of French during World War I. Who was the first Latino graduate? You'll have to figure it out, I was told, in motion toward yellowing yearbooks and leather-bound copies of alumni records. And so we did. To the best of our knowledge, it was Dr. Carlos Margarita of Puerto Rico, class of 1943. In a moment, we'll hear more from Constance Holden, speaking about the first Black woman graduate, Lucia Vincent. Most of all, I decided that I didn't want to go on this journey of the book alone. I knew that there were all these brilliant Amherst students out there who might help if only I could find the right ones. In that, I was extraordinarily fortunate. You're about to hear from my research assistants who made this project something more than just a job. I am caught up forever in their brilliant careers, and I know they will go far, for they have both mind and heart. Before we move on, I just wanted to plant a question out there in your heads for all of the people in our Zoom audience to cogitate on. Did you self-medicate at Amherst? With curiosity, I mean, and if so, what was your most memorable example? Okay, next to speak will be Constance Holden from the class of 2015. Constance is a second-year PhD student at the University of Connecticut. She studies the histories of the African diaspora in the US and Latin America, focusing on representations of race, gender, and nation in popular culture. Originally from Bridgeport, Connecticut, Constance has traveled across Europe and the Americas, including Chile, Argentina, and Ecuador. At Amherst, Constance served as the historian for the Black Student Union, chair of the 2015 Black Alumni Weekend Planning Committee, and co-chair of the bi-semester Christian Worship Series. After graduating from Amherst with a BA in Spanish and a 5-college certificate in Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx studies, she pursued a career in international and higher education. A passion for storytelling anchors her academic and personal pursuits. She's dedicated to cultivating a greater sense of belonging, equity, and inclusion in the stories that she shares, aiming to inspire radical imaginings of the future. Constance?
Thank you for that introduction, Nancy. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I am truly grateful to share this space with you. Thank you again to Nancy, to my fellow research assistants, and to the entire team that's helped organize this event. I really came to this project with the help of Matt Randolph, who you'll hear from in a bit. And he introduced me to Nancy in 2017. And Matt invited me, Nancy welcomed me, and the rest is history. And I'm so grateful to be here again today. And so perhaps the biggest lesson from this project has been that you really cannot include everything, no matter how much you want to, no matter how curious you are, you can't include everything. And even when you reach seemingly dead ends in research, there's always ways to creatively reimagine and reinterpret what you have found. And even when it's not what you wanted to discover, you find what you need in order to tell the story that you set out to tell. And so for the next few minutes, I'm going to focus on two Black women of Amherst College who appear in the book, whose stories reveal the importance of student support and Amherst's journey toward becoming a light in the world. Dean Anawumi Jean Moss, who joined Amherst in 1985 as the coordinator of student support services and later associate dean of students, and Lucia Butts, later Vincent, class of 1977, the first Black woman graduate of the college. I reflect on what I learned from each of their experiences at Amherst and also the opportunities that their stories really present for thinking about how stories are told and how histories are made. And so thinking back to 2018 was a dark, snowy night. I believe it's always snowing in Amherst, so there probably was snow on the ground. And I drove to Dean Moss's home to conduct an interview. We had a great meal and we talked for hours. And Dean Moss was such a pivotal mentor to me during my time at Amherst. And so to have that space to commune with her and to feel how she was reflecting on her time at Amherst, she had just this twinkle in her eye, this magic that just seemed to be swirling in her eyes. It was really a joy to experience her outside of Chapin, where we usually were together. And according to the interview and what she shared, Dean Moss understood her purpose clearly at Amherst: to help students have safe passage through the college, as quoted in the book. Dean Moss, when arriving in the mid-'80s, sought to understand, quote, the importance of dealing with the dimensions that were Amherst, that made up Amherst, and the different layers of Amherst. For Dean Moss, it was important for students to be heard, seen, and understood. She is at heart a storyteller, and it was critical that her role at the college gave students space to write their own stories. She guided so many students into finding their voices. She shared the story of one student from the class of 1997, who Dean Moss identified as having spearheaded one of the most important civil discourses about unpleasant things at Amherst. The student went to Dean Moss's office one day in 1994 and said, Dean Moss, we're having a difficult time, and it isn't because we don't want to, but we don't feel welcome here. And Dean Moss encouraged them to take the lead in organizing a meeting at Charles Drew House with faculty, staff, and students. This meeting, which came to be known as the Drew House Forum, culminated in a campaign called A Promise to Keep, a commitment by faculty to cultivate a supportive and equitable learning environment inside and outside the classroom. The Moss Quantitative Resource Center, or Q Center as it's affectionately known, was a direct result of this, although it took 10 years to get off the ground. But Dean Moss made sure that there were programs at the college that magnified voices and uplifted everyone's eyes to see just how special of a place Amherst was and how even more special it could become. And that was just one of the many things that Dean Moss shared. She started so many things. She's an icon. She started Kwanzaa. She was really involved with student activism on campus, storytelling. She was everywhere. And so when Dean Moss retired in 2006, alumni took time to curate a scrapbook of heartfelt messages that spoke to the impact of Dean Moss in their lives. According to a 2006 write-up in the Amherst magazine, one alum expressed, quote, I can hear your voice in so many aspects of my life, and it always reminds me to respect myself, to speak up, and to be courageous. You've always been a shining example of these things to me. Dean Moss was the eye, mind, and heart of the college in so many ways. Through her tenure at the college, we see the transformation of Amherst into a place that more fully embraced the call to take seriously the development of its students. Amherst's story is not one of linear progress towards perfection, toward this elusive better, but it is one where students, faculty, and staff collaborate, reimagine, refashion, pivot, and adjust, ever in the pursuit of making Amherst a fruitful and meaningful experience for all. But 8 years before Dean Moss started at the college, Lucia Butts was ending hers. She came to Amherst in 1976 from Smith, graduating with the class of 1977 as the first Black woman graduate. Lucia studied music, English, and political science. After Amherst, she pursued a career in film and television, appearing on shows like The West Wing and Sweet Jane, and adopted Lucia Vincent as her stage name, and I'll refer to her as Lucia Vincent moving forward, and sometimes going by Irene. She worked a series of odd jobs at various agencies in California, but in 2002, she published a book called Sexual Lynching, which describes her journey in seeking justice for sexual harassment. She faced a seemingly endless cycle of harassment and retaliation from lawyers, colleagues, to name a few. She found her judgment and sanity questioned on multiple occasions, which you can see in the Amazon reviews for the book. In the book, I looked at it again. There's only one instance where she mentions Amherst, and she just says it's a great school. And so that doesn't really say much about her experience at the college. And debates now abound about whether her book was fictional or nonfiction. But throughout the book, Lucia shows a depth of self-awareness and a desire to be well. At Amherst, as one of 2 women who joined the college that year and the only Black woman, there is no doubt that it wasn't an easy time where she encountered racist or sexist aggressions. And so no doubt that combined with the challenges of her courses and just what the 1970s was in our nation's history and the college's history, it was hard. And she had to constantly evaluate and prioritize her mental health and wellness. And she had to practice self-care at an institution that wasn't ready for her quite yet. And Amherst was undoubtedly working its way toward becoming more inclusive, more willing, more open. Amherst always in the business of renegotiating the promises it needed to keep to its students, faculty, and staff, and alumni as it continued to figure out what kind of institution it was going to be. And Lucia passed away in 2011, the year that I started my time at Amherst. I didn't discover her story until my senior year, doing research for Black Alumni Week in 2015. And even then, she appeared fleetingly in the archives. I wanted more information. I wanted to know how she navigated Amherst and if and how she eventually felt as if she belonged. But she was too elusive. Amherst wasn't keeping track of their firsts, so it was hard. And did she want to be found? And I continued to ask these questions in doing research for this book. What more would she want the world to know? And Amherst and Smith both had only brief biographical files. She's not even included in the 1999 book on Black Women of Amherst College by Professor Campbell. And so how do we move forward in constructing a storytelling and archival process that allows for what historian Jessica Marie Johnson calls, quote, an accountable historical practice that challenges the known and unknowable about the lives of Black women and girls? How do we approach better understandings of the interior lives of women at the college, about student life? And does the answer lie in continuing works like this one, or continuing projects like the new recent projects on Black women of Amherst College that give space to more alumni, staff, students, and faculty to share their stories? How do we understand these silences and also fill them and move forward? And so ultimately, I left this experience with way more questions than answers. I realized that questions were also more important than answers, as you're left with renewed curiosities instead of finite satisfaction of certainties. And so I realized from this process that Amherst is in a constant process of becoming, of shifting, molding, shaping, changing, transforming. And I admire and love that about Amherst. It makes space for change and embraces it. Dean Moss and Lucia Vincent changed Amherst just as much as Amherst changed them. Problems and challenges are meant to refine, not define. And there's just so much for future research. And this book is truly a point of departure. And Amherst, as we see through these stories, We see all that Amherst was, is, all that it could be, and all that it's meant to be, a light and a process, and a light, a promise, and in the process of becoming. Thank you.
Thank you, Constance. As always, incredibly insightful. Next up is Michael Harmon from the class of 2016. After 4 years as an Amherst College tour guide, talking up the open curriculum to anyone who would listen, Michael graduated in 2016, intent on living an open curriculum of a postgraduate life. He has lived in a 13th century Cambridge college while earning a Master of Philosophy degree in the history of science. He has shared an apartment in Manhattan with his brother Josh from the class of 2018 while working in a neurology lab. And he's moved to South Africa's Londolozi Game Reserve to live and work in the bush as a writer and a wildlife blogger. At Amherst, Michael created his own major, writing a travelogue thesis chronicling his research trip along a stretch of the Cape to Cairo Railway. And as a senior, he organized a series of 6 faculty talks on the history of the college, believing then, as he does now, that the shared experience of Amherst history can strengthen our connections both to the campus and to each other.
Nancy, thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining, to the college for making this possible, to my fellow research assistants. It's great to be on the same panel as all of you. My initial topic for this talk was going to be Valentine Dining Hall cereals through the years, an exploration of the evolution from shredded wheat through honey bunches of oats. But it occurred to me, since this is, as was mentioned, our reunion weekend, and it's virtual, it's over Zoom, it's even more amazing to reflect on one of my favorite parts of working on this book, which was interviewing a couple of Amherst's Nobel laureate alumni. And that sounds, at the time, it sounded like an incredible prospect, pretty daunting, but certainly exciting. And now it seems almost unfathomable since we're all gathered together virtually. But in thinking about what I could bring to this talk and thinking about this project as a whole, there really was one afternoon that stood out to me above everything else. And that was talking to Joseph Stiglitz, class of 1964, and Nobel laureate in economics, awarded to him in 2001. Now, I spoke to 2 different laureates, and I emailed with another one who wasn't able to meet in person. And Edmund Phelps, who graduated in '55, won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2006. He described Amherst as a magical place. Harold Varmus, class of '61, who won the Nobel Prize jointly in physiology or medicine in 1989. He was very happily recounting stories of being an English major at Amherst. Now, keep in mind, physiology or medicine, but an English major, that's a very Amherst trajectory, I would say. And he was telling me about writing his senior thesis with Bill Pritchard, who, if you take a look at the course catalog for the fall semester of 2021 coming up, you'll note that Bill Pritchard is scheduled to teach a course, I think, on modern British and American literature, 1900 to 1950. And again, Harold Varmus graduated 1961. So I'll let the more quantitatively aligned among us do the math there. But that was a very inspiring conversation. But it was talking to Professor Stiglitz. I met him at Columbia, where he's the university professor. Talking to him, I found was an enlivening experience and not just a life-affirming one, but really an Amherst education-affirming one. Because this is someone who was speaking so passionately about the courses that he took and the professors who shaped his worldview and who influenced not just his time at Amherst, but his career, his way of thinking about economics, about other fields. And so if everyone who's on this call could just take a minute and think to yourselves, what classes did I take in the spring semester of my sophomore year? Try to remember who taught those classes, what subject matter was covered in those classes. Maybe if there was something that you read in one of them that stood out as having a real impact on you. So take a second, try to assemble your spring semester sophomore year course schedule in your head. Now, as I was preparing to talk to all of you, I was struggling for a second to think of that fourth course. I knew that for me, organic chemistry was in the mix. There was a biology class in there and a wonderful poli-sci class, but I couldn't remember the fourth course, and I graduated in 2016. So as a point of contrast, Joseph Stiglitz said to me, point blank, without exaggerating, and he then proved this in our conversation, he said, I could tell you every class I took, which semester I took it in, which professor I had for each class, and what was covered in that class. And he spoke at length, listing some of those classes and professors who shaped him and who made his time at Amherst such a memorable one. I'll share a few of them, but that blew me away because this is someone who, as you can imagine, a Nobel laureate. He's done a lot since graduating from Amherst, and he's had a vast number of academic experiences and posts, and he could tell me his entire course schedule from freshman fall to senior spring. So a few of those, maybe some of you on the call or in our Zoom room gathering will remember taking courses with these professors. But again, with this look in his eye, he was telling me about taking English 1 and 2 with Theodore Baird and Ben DeMott, which obviously that's a power combination in the history of Amherst English. And he said he particularly remembered reading The Jabberwocky and Alice in Wonderland in his freshman English 1 and 2 courses. He said Ralph Bales, Bob Romer in physics, and Professor Halstead teaching a 19th century intellectual history course all made a real impact on him. And he had a particularly fond recollection of a seminar on The Tempest with a Professor Caleb. Again, he was really riffing. He could tell me any course, pull it out of his head. But a couple that really stood out to me, he said he took a freshman elective course in economics with Professor Jim Nelson, who he described as a fantastically vibrant person. And it was that class with Professor Nelson, and then further classes with a man named Arnold Collery, also an economics professor, who launched Joseph Stiglitz on his path towards studying economics at the graduate level, set him on a trajectory towards MIT, which is where he did his graduate work. And in a really moving twist and alignment of the universe, when I met with him, which was in 2018, Professor Stiglitz said that Professor Collery at Amherst then went on to be a dean at Columbia and eventually became the chair of the Columbia Economics Department. And he passed away in 1989 at the age of only 62. And there's now a classroom in the Department of Economics at Columbia where Professor Stiglitz teaches an economics class. And that classroom is named after Professor Collery, who was one of his Amherst mentors. And I met with Joseph Stiglitz, and he said, I'm teaching a class on Monday in that room, named after his Amherst mentor. So it was very moving, I found, to be talking to someone who's so accomplished, who's done so much, seen so much of the world, and had such an influence and an impact on the way that we think and imagine economic systems and structures. And he was so visibly moved and thrilled to be reliving these wonderful moments in his own time at Amherst. He described himself as academically omnivorous, and he said, I'll leave you with this, talking about Joseph Stiglitz's reminiscences. He said, I think I liked every one of my classes. And that seems like a pretty, innocuous statement, but to have that feeling about your entire Amherst academic career looking back is a beautiful thing. So I was thinking about this conversation as we were working on the book and as it was coming to its final stages. And the question that's really been at the forefront for me is, and it's a somewhat obvious one, is what does Amherst history mean? Why are we doing this? Why are we talking about it? Why are we discussing a book that with so much time and care and dedication has come together to tell us the story of Amherst? And what does it mean for us as alumni to be part of a shared history? I went to an Amherst gathering in New York City a couple of years ago when it was possible to gather in person and talk about Amherst together. And President Martin said something that has stayed with me, which is that Amherst College and colleges in general are one of the few sources of truly intergenerational community that we can be a part of. And as churches and synagogues and other houses of worship become less central in a lot of young people's lives, and other forms of that kind of community across generations are a little bit harder to tap into, to say nothing about the last year and change. It's remarkable to be able to talk to someone who graduated from Amherst 30, 40, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and talk about Memorial Hill and how Joseph Stiglitz maybe went down on skis, which was a thrill to him because he was from the Midwest where everything was flat, he said, or to share that I would go down Memorial Hill on a Valentine dining hall tray. But it was the same hill and the same sense of fun, and probably slightly illicit fun, given the college's stance on going down Memorial Hill on anything other than your own feet. But that is a special thing, to feel like you have roots to a place. And this is why I'm crossing my fingers that our class, 2016, will be able to have an in-person reunion, even if it's a year late, because doing things virtually for 14 plus months has been an extremely stark reminder of how important it is to feel a connection and a sense of rootedness to a place. This project has been such a joy to be a part of, because it's just reinforced that feeling for me and anyone that I've talked to in the course of this project, whether it's a fellow student, fellow alum, or a Nobel laureate of extreme esteem and fame in the world academic sphere. There's a shared sense of reverence for the place and for the professors who made that place for all of us, and for our peers, who obviously so many of us still hold as our dearest friends. So I am thrilled to have had that opportunity, and I really do thank Nancy for thinking of me and suggesting the Nobel laureate project, sub-project within the book, because it was a thrill to meet these people, to talk to them, and to have that sense of shared Amherstness. So thank you all for listening, and I echo what Nancy said, buy the book, you won't regret it.
Thank you, Michael, for getting at all of these essential Amherst questions and questions about what the essential Amherst even is. Next, Matthew Randolph, also from the class of 2016. He was a history and Spanish double major who served as the historian for the Black Student Union during his time at Amherst. Matt is originally from the Baltimore area, but after graduating, he migrated to California. And now he can hardly tolerate weather below 40 degrees. He wonders how he ever survived 4 Amherst winters. Matt is now in his second year of a history PhD program at Stanford, where he focuses on the history of the African diaspora in both the US and Latin America. He cherishes the art of storytelling inside and outside the classroom, and has volunteered at local museums throughout the Bay Area, including the African American Museum and Library at Oakland and the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I really appreciate that introduction. I'm so thankful to you and also um, Constance and Michael, the fellow research assistants, for making this book possible and being able to be a part of this. I also wanted to just shout out the history department because for me, the experience of majoring in history was so transformative, not only because I was exposed to world history, but I was always encouraged to think about the global and the local at the same time. And so to appreciate the history of the world, sometimes you have to look at what's right in front of you. And that lesson from my history professors encouraged me to actually want to do a special topics class during my senior year on Amherst's history, because I don't think you can really learn history of the world without kind of focusing locally sometimes. And you can't understand that local experience without putting in a global context. So these things work together. So yeah, for me as someone who's really passionate about international history, I've actually learned so much by kind of honing in on a particular place like Amherst College. So as a research assistant for my work, I focus primarily on African-American history and Latinx history, but particularly the history of recruitment to the college. So how did the college over time try to become more and more diverse? What did this mean over time? This was very fitting for me since I worked at the admissions office as a student, as a diversity intern, where we worked on recruiting students from underrepresented communities throughout the US and the world. In addition to this work on recruitment, I also had a chance to explore the history of affinity groups. So these are groups and organizations that support and celebrate students and all their diversity. So among other things, my primary research projects were outreach, so reaching out to students and alumni, and also interviewing alumni and capturing their experiences. So for the next few minutes, I'll walk you through the insights I gained from these interviews with alumni. So one character who's not around today, but who resurfaced throughout my research was Eugene Wilson. He was Amherst admissions dean from the 1940s to the 1970s, and he is known for working to equalize recruitment from public and private high schools. So this is a very important moment in Amherst history where the idea of being an Amherst student is starting to change, where it's not just about coming from a private school, but it could also be a public school, and these worlds are starting to equalize more and more with Dean Wilson's efforts. And in the process, Wilson's also a prominent figure in African-American history at Amherst. Although he's a white admissions dean, he developed very strong relationships with the Black community in Washington, D.C. For some class years, students from Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. made up the majority, if not the entirety, of Black students attending Amherst. As a Black public high school in a separate and unequal school system, Dunbar upended the traditional notion of feeder schools as private, predominantly white institutions like Exeter, Deerfield, and Andover. Thanks to Wilson's efforts, as well as the efforts of African-American alumni, Dunbar men from Washington, D.C. often entered Amherst in pairs or even cohorts of 3 or more. They included men who would become household names in African-American history, such as Charles Hamilton Houston, who Nancy mentioned, but also Charles Drew, whose medical innovations around blood plasma were critical for preserving blood during World War II. William Hastie, a groundbreaking federal judge, and Montague Cobb, a president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. However, by the 1960s, Dunbar students would no longer be the primary representation for African-American students. And the college would start to recruit some more diverse range of students beyond DC. A lot of this is due to changing political dynamics, but also the idea that a Black public high school would fade into history as schools desegregated. And you have an expansion of where students are coming from. So when I had a chance to interview Cuthbert Simpkins, I realized that his experience from New York totally changed the narrative of what it meant to be a Black Amherst student. So like his predecessors from Dunbar, Simpkins did mention Wilson as someone who recruited him, but there was a discontinuity here from the early generation of African-American students. So, oh, sorry, I'm lost my my place here. 1 second. Right, so there was a discontinuity with Simpkins because unlike the previous students, let me just skip around for a second. I'm so sorry about this technical issue. Okay, here we go. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. So for the previous generations of Amherst students before Simpkins, what I found was that they often experienced a sense of struggle that was not surfaced, that was not made clear. And they often held things inside because they didn't have an opportunity, they didn't have spaces to actually share their experiences. In April 1889, this is in the late 19th century, one African-American student, William Tecumseh Sherman Jackson, had to endure a college campus with a minstrel show taking place at a nearby city hall in Northampton. In the promotional flyer, the baseball team even sold round-trip train tickets, including admission to the minstrel show, and proclaimed the racist comedy show as all for baseball. A few years later, in May 1893, student journalists would report that this event's plantation melodies were received with hearty applause and were repeatedly encored. So one can only imagine the discomfort and disappointment, if not the fear and outrage, students like William Tecumseh Sherman Jackson experienced in the late 19th century. But in spite of these dynamics in Amherst athletic culture, Jackson excelled as a track athlete, and after graduation became an advocate for Amherst, encouraging students at Dunbar to attend his alma mater in spite of the tough experiences he had. Similarly, Black track athletes throughout the 1920s practiced alongside their white peers, but when they competed outside of Amherst, they often had to eat at separate dining halls. And when on the road for matches at other schools, businesses would discriminate against them, and this would leave a dark rift between themselves and the white students that they were so used to practicing with. So even as these students built camaraderie with their white classmates on campus, the realities of racial difference and segregation often reasserted themselves off campus, even in the North. In 1925, 3 of these Black students, Cobb, Drew, and Hasty, ate alone at Brown University dining hall while the rest of the team dined at a local hotel. The hotel management heard that there were colored boys on the Amherst team and would send word that they would not serve them. And the ride back home from Providence to Amherst was shrouded in silence. This sense of silence would continue into the 1950s when Raymond Hayes from the class of 1959 would hold in some of the experiences he had until 50 years later when he returned to campus. Quote, not until the 50th class reunion would Black students Raymond Hayes and Lawrence Burwell call out the separatist housing policies that continued into the 1950s. At that point, Hayes reflected that our quote, requests for roommates were denied and single rooms into different dormitories were assigned to us. Hayes recalled that there were no Black faculty, administrators, or mentoring programs. Hayes and Burwell duly acknowledged how Amherst encouraged their successes, but he said so much more could have been offered to ease the discomforts of those formative years. It took him 50 years to have the courage to share these grievances. And so it was so meaningful after having done that research to talk with Simpkins, with Cooper Simpkins, who was actually a founder of the Afro-American Society, which would later become the Black Student Union, and would be able to challenge the administration to become more inclusive of African-American students on campus, would work with the missions office to recruit students from around the country. And I'm just gonna read a quote from Simpkins about the confidence that he gained to create this student organization. He says, I talked to Harold Wade, Amherst class in 1968, and I said, Harold, I think we should form an organization. And he said he didn't think it would work because the Black students were all very individualistic. I thought it over and decided to do it anyway. And he supported me. So we all got together in Valentine and we talked it over. We had an election and I was elected the first president of the Afro-American Society by a majority of 1 vote. You can read more of the interview in the book. But I think this is really important. And it's because this is not just a pivotal moment in Black pride and community building on campus, but it shows how different generations had different ways to manage the tough experiences they were having. I learned that each generation had different ways to manage the reality of racial discrimination. For Charles Drew's generation in the 1920s, in spite of the issues with the track team, they created their own ukulele band on campus with other Black students, using informal spaces to get through tough times in spite of some of the discrimination they experienced. But by the 1960s, these spaces became more formalized with the Afro-American Society and the Black Student Union. So I think what's really important here for me was how you always have to think about historical context when you're doing this research. And I was able to have empathy for each generation and how they navigated these different experiences. There were, for all these generations, whether they were in the more activist years of the 1960s or the more silent years, one thing is constant. It's this feeling of both belonging and feeling of isolation. It wasn't an either or. And Black students throughout Amherst's 200 years worked creatively to manage that situation. In addition to exploring the history of Black alumni and the Black Student Union's origin, I also interviewed recent alumni who founded and led student groups that began within the past decade. There were definitely common threads with these spaces, and just like Cuthbert Simpkins in the 1960s, these affinity groups in the 21st century provided students with a sense of community and belonging on campus. So for myself, as a Black Student Union historian, I learned so much about the past, and it made me feel more confident in my own journey at Amherst, learning that there were so many people before me who could make it at Amherst too. When I interviewed Kelly Jones from the class of '81, an art historian and MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, she told me that living in Charles Drew House was transformative. Living in the house named after him was exciting and pushed her to learn more about him. There was something special about having the same experiences of Kelly. We both felt like the Charles Drew House gave us a sense of belonging on campus. And I think this reminds me of what Michael was saying about the rootedness to a place that the college provides. It's this rare chance for intergenerational community. Through these interviews, realizing that I had the same experiences of the people I interviewed made me realize that the residential college is something that you cannot replicate over Zoom, that there's something really special that we're going to get back to when people can have a sense of place and shared memory. So for some affinity groups today, like the African and Caribbean Student Union, very similarly to the Black Student Union, they said that their weekly meetings felt like true family gatherings. And I think that that's what makes affinity groups unique and special at Amherst. It's not just a sense of community for students with particular experiences. It's not just people having chances to meet on their own, but I also realized how all of these groups, while they build a sense of affirmation for a particular identity or culture, they also all see it as their mission to share their experiences, cultures, and traditions with the wider campus community. ACSU, the African Caribbean Student Union, has 3 special events, which I learned about from my fellow students, but also from doing research. There's Where's the Love Feast, a cooking dinner of traditional African and Caribbean dishes to empower students to share a taste of home with fellow students. There's Wave Your Flag Weekend, where guests wear traditional clothing from their national culture and perform pieces, celebrating their identity while enjoying a meal. There's a fashion show where people celebrate the arts through music and dance. And all of these events were open to the public, and they were not just internal events. These affinity groups serve as a dual purpose at Amherst, achieving a balance between intra-community togetherness and outreach to the wider community. And these processes of affirmation is what made it possible for people to thrive at Amherst. And I think that's really important, that these spaces are not just spaces for people to gather amongst people with similar experiences, but also to share those experiences with the wider college. The empowerment and self-confidence that students feel from these affinity groups also allows them to pursue their own professional dreams in addition to thriving on campus. So the founder of the Amherst Women in Computer Science group, Elizabeth Lefevre, class of 2016, told me that after attending a computer science conference at Harvard, she returned to Amherst feeling inspired to create change. The conference's workshops, especially hearing from women about their experiences in technology, was incredibly empowering for her and gave her the confidence to pursue computer science as a major, despite the fact that few women at Amherst could be seen in computer science classrooms. Lefevre also wrote that the events organized by the Amherst Women in Computer Science Club and the close-knit community there was instrumental in her journey to become a software engineer at Google. So again, these spaces are so dynamic, and I think this is what makes Amherst unique, this celebration of diversity, but also really committed to making sure that that diversity is spread throughout the campus. And I think these affinity groups do that work. These student-led groups are doing that work of creating space for students to feel a sense of belonging while also allowing them to share their experiences with the rest of the college and the world. So in conclusion, the chance to do these interviews with alumni of many generations taught me a lot about the process of writing community history. Interviewing alumni living today of all ages and generations about their experiences taught me the importance of doing history actively, not just relying on what's in the archive or what's already been written. In other words, this project was generative for all of us because we actually created an archive together from the present moment, from the memories that people still hold. It wasn't about synthesizing what we have we already have, but this coffee table book was an original work in itself. We did investigations to get at the stories that might not have been in the archive, so that we could include experiences to show how inclusive and diverse the college has become. So I think I'm taking this to heart, this idea of active history. And when I want to tell a story in the future as a historian, to always think about not what's already out there, but how can I also reach out and try to capture memories for history. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Well, I think everybody can see why this book was such a transformative process for me, that I was able to work with these young, brilliant, passionate students who are turning into young, brilliant, passionate intellectuals and people out there changing the world. So we have maybe just a minute for a question or two. Would anybody like, well, if there aren't any questions, I can read this lovely little piece that, oh, Jess, Jack. You have to unmute yourself, Jack.
Nancy, it's just want to remind you that Matt has the questions for you, so he can read those.
Yes, I can read some of the questions we've already received, and then we can add some more. Let's see. Okay, so this is a good question. So we have a question about the role of the 5 College Consortium in Amherst history. For some of us who attended Amherst in the mid-70s, it was a big part of our Amherst experience. And so I think just kind of hearing how Amherst was written about in context with the wider 5 colleges.
So I didn't really take that on. I mean, as you can imagine, there was an overwhelming amount of material just trying to write about Amherst. There were definitely points where, you know, the consortium was sort of forming and then it was expanding, and possibly if Hampshire doesn't survive, it's going to contract again. So I did briefly touch on that, but it just seemed that it wasn't really critical to understanding the trajectory of Amherst over 200 years.
Right, sometimes you have to make
you
choices.
You have to just make tough choices.
We actually have a question for Michael about Muller, if you want to share more about Muller's experience.
Well, Matt, I don't have much to add on that topic, but I do, and I'm not saying this in jest, I know a place where you can learn more about it, and that is in the Nobel laureate section of the book, because I read it this morning, and it's a doozy. So I can't tell you off the top of my head anything more about Muller, but it's in there. So
we also have one more question that I see kind of about Asian American history at Amherst, the Asian American Studies major, the first Asian American student organization. When did it start? But Nancy, I think this kind of also relates to some stuff you brought up about the Shisha, so about how Asian American history is actually very central to college, and even in the 19th century. And if you want to kind of provide that context, even before the 20th century, there was a story there.
Yeah, the Asian American history of Amherst really does go very deep, and it is very old. And those ties, particularly with Japan, there were really consistently Japanese students at Amherst over quite a number of years, going all the way back to 1870. But Matt, I think the book that you have an essay in, Amherst in the World, that has actually a more comprehensive essay on the history of Asian students at Amherst. Is that right?
Right. Tomorrow there will be a talk from Ann Shin, and he'll be talking a little bit about the connections between Amherst and China. And yeah, so these questions of Amherst's relationship with the world, particularly with China, which is really rooted in the history of missionaries as well. That will be explored tomorrow. So all this to say is that the relationship between Amherst and Asian countries is not like a recent phenomenon. It didn't start with, the Asian American Studies major, but actually goes back to the 19th century.
Kim, again, I'm going to jump in a little bit. I know Jack had his hand raised, so I think he is going to be the lucky last question. So I'm going to ask him to unmute. Jack?
Thank you. I'm trying. There you go. I'd just like to say one thing about, one big thing about race at Amherst. I pledged the Phi Psi fraternity. I'm proud of it. I'm glad that the book has so much about it. I once, on a visit to Amherst, maybe a reunion, walked by the Drew House, which we desegregated with Tom Gibbs. And they were serving barbecue. They offered me barbecue. I was just going by. And I said, it turned out they had not heard of Tom Gibbs. I mean, this was 40 years, let's say, later. So much more needs to be done every generation to remind people. And that goes for Charles Hamilton Houston also. Oh, anyway, it's there. It's wonderful. It's
These stories are really important, and it is amazing how easily they get lost.
Yes,
Right?
It's very good. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We are out of time, and I just want to say thank you, Nancy, Matt, Constance, and Michael. Really appreciate your thoughts today. And the information about Nancy's book was in the chat a couple of times with the link to our Bicentennial book page where you can find out more and also purchase the book. If you want to see more of this, Nancy is also doing presentations on the book in June, and you'll get more information about that in another couple of weeks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.